The rain started before anyone expected it to. Not the kind that taps politely on leaves and disappears into the soil, but the kind that darkens the sky in minutes, thickens the air, and makes the forest feel smaller with every breath. The boy noticed it before anyone else. He always did. At 16, he had learned to listen to the mountain and the jungle the way other people listen to radios. The birds had gone quiet too early. The insects had climbed higher up the trunks. The wind carried a sour, wet smell that meant the clouds were already breaking somewhere far upriver. By the time the first heavy drops struck the canopy, the neighbors were still laughing. They stood under the overhang of their sturdier huts, watching him work, shaking their heads. A wooden shelter, they said, in a place where rain never stopped. Thin walls, slanted beams, gaps left on purpose. They called it a joke, a child's experiment, something that would rot and collapse the first night the real storms came. Some of them shouted advice he didn't ask for. Others mocked quietly, confident they were right. The boy didn't answer. He rarely did. He adjusted the angle of a beam, pressed his shoulder into it, and listened to how the wood settled. The shelter sat slightly above the ground, not high enough to look impressive, but high enough to let water pass beneath. Its roof was layered, not thick, but smartly overlapped. The walls weren't sealed tight. They breathed. When the rain finally hit in full, it came down like a curtain dropped from the sky. The jungle swallowed sound. Leaves thrashed. Water poured off branches in sheets. Within minutes, paths vanished, turning into shallow streams. The neighbors retreated into their homes, still amused, still certain that the boy's shelter would be flattened before morning. Inside the wooden structure, the boy sat quietly and waited. Rain hammered the roof, but it didn't drum the way they expected. It slid. It ran along the grooves he'd carved with careful hands. The wind pushed, but the shelter bent just enough to give, not enough to break. Water flowed under the raised floor, rushing past instead of pooling. The air inside stayed cool, not damp. He listened to the storm the way he listened to fire at night, letting it speak. Hours passed. The rain didn't slow. It grew heavier. By nightfall, the jungle was no longer a place of paths and clearings. It was water and darkness and sound. Somewhere uphill, something gave way. A low, distant crack rolled through the trees, followed by a deep, rushing roar. The river had broken its banks. The boy felt it before he saw it. The ground trembled, subtle but unmistakable. He stood, stepped outside for a moment, and watched water surge where dry earth had been that morning. He didn't panic. He moved with the same calm that had made people underestimate him all his life. He adjusted a support post, cleared debris from the channel he'd carved beneath the shelter, and returned inside. Elsewhere, panic was starting to spread. Huts built low to the ground began to flood. Water crept through doorways, soaked bedding, extinguished fires. Roofs that had always been good enough started to drip, then leak, then pour. People scrambled to move belongings higher, to stack crates, to bail water with bowls. Laughter disappeared, replaced by sharp voices and hurried footsteps. The rain kept coming. By midnight, some shelters had collapsed entirely. Rotting beams gave way under the weight of waterlogged roofs. Mudslides swept across the lower paths, cutting off escape routes. The jungle, so familiar in daylight, turned hostile in the dark. Insects swarmed the few remaining dry spots. Fires died. Fear settled in. From his wooden shelter, the boy heard shouting carried on the wind. He opened the door and looked out. The water had risen higher, but it still flowed cleanly beneath him. The structure creaked softly, alive but stable. He could see lantern light, flickering in the distance, moving erratically. Someone slipped and fell. Someone else shouted their name. He hesitated only a moment. Pulling his jacket tight, he stepped into the rain and moved carefully through the flooded ground. He knew where the water would be deepest, where the current was strongest. He'd watched how rain moved long before he ever built the shelter. He reached the nearest struggling family and guided them back, one careful step at a time, toward the raised wooden platform they had mocked just hours earlier. At first, they didn't understand. They stared at the shelter, soaked and exhausted, disbelief written on their faces. This was the joke, the useless thing, the child's project. But inside it was dry enough. Not warm, but safe. The roof shed water instead of trapping it. The walls let air move, preventing the heavy, suffocating damp that clung everywhere else. The floor stayed solid beneath their feet. More people came as the night wore on. Some arrived angry, some desperate, some silent with shock. The boy made room for all of them. He shifted supplies, adjusted supports, showed them where to sit, so the weight stayed balanced. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't explain. He just worked. Outside, the storm reached its peak. Trees fell. The sound of snapping trunks echoed through the jungle like distant thunder. Water surged and receded in unpredictable waves. Shelters that had stood for decades finally gave up, their foundations undermined by water that never stopped moving. The jungle erased certainty with every passing hour. Inside the wooden shelter, time slowed. The boy listened to the rhythm of rain on the roof, to the breathing of the people around him, to the subtle shifts of the structure responding to wind and water. He noticed how the shelter stayed cooler than the soaked huts, how the air moved just enough to keep everyone from shivering uncontrollably. He noticed how fear slowly gave way to something else. Trust. By morning, the rain began to thin, not stopping, but easing. Gray light filtered through the canopy. The jungle emerged transformed. What had been paths were now channels. What had been homes were now wreckage. People stepped carefully outside the shelter, stunned by what they saw. The boy stood at the edge of the platform, looking out over the damage. Mud coated everything. Broken beams lay tangled in vines. The river had carved new routes through the land. And standing above it all, quiet and intact, was the wooden shelter they had laughed at. No one laughed now. They asked questions instead. How did he know where to build? Why did he leave gaps in the walls? Why raise it just enough, but not too much? He answered simply, without pride. He talked about watching water move after storms, about how the jungle punished anything that tried to fight it instead of work with it. He talked about wood that bends instead of snapping, about letting rain pass through instead of trapping it. They listened. As the day went on, the rain returned in waves, but the panic did not. People repaired what they could. They copied what they had seen. They raised floors, angled roofs, carved channels. The boy helped where he could, moving quietly from place to place, never staying long. By evening, when the jungle settled into its wet, humming calm, the shelter still stood. It bore marks of the storm, scratches, stains, signs of stress, but it held. It had done what it was meant to do, and for the first time since he'd begun building it, the boy allowed himself to rest. He sat inside as the rain softened to a steady whisper, listening to the jungle breathe. The shelter creaked gently, familiar now, like an old friend. Outside, the neighbors moved differently. They spoke more softly. They looked at the boy with something close to respect, though he never looked back to claim it. The storm would return one day. He knew that. The jungle always tested those who lived within it. But when it did, they would remember this night. They would remember the wooden shelter they called a joke, and how, when the rain came harder than it ever had before, it became the only safe place left. And the boy, quiet as ever, would already be watching the clouds, listening, preparing for whatever came next. The rain did not stop after the first night. That was the mistake everyone made. They thought the storm had spent itself. They thought the sky had said what it needed to say, and would move on, like storms usually did in these parts of the jungle. Loud entrance, dramatic downpour, swollen streams for a day or two, then silence broken by insects and steam. But this rain stayed. It stayed through the morning. It stayed through the afternoon. It stayed through the night again. And with every hour, the jungle changed its posture. Paths softened first, then vanished. What had been firm earth turned into slick clay that sucked at boots and refused to let go. Leaves sagged under the constant weight of water. Trees groaned, not from wind, but from saturation, their roots drinking faster than the soil could release. The boy noticed this before anyone else. He stood just inside the narrow entrance of his wooden shelter, listening to the sound of rain on layered leaves and split planks. Not the volume, the rhythm, the way it no longer came in bursts, but in a steady, endless sheet, as if the sky had opened a valve it could not close. He touched the interior wall. It was dry, not warm, not comfortable, but dry. That mattered more than anyone understood yet. Across the clearing, men moved about their larger shelters, stepping around puddles that had not been there the day before. Smoke struggled to rise from wet firewood. Roofs that had seemed sturdy began to sag under the combined weight of water and swollen fibers. Someone laughed nervously and said, "It'll pass." The boy said nothing. He had built a shelter low, not because it looked humble, but because water respected gravity more than pride. The structure hugged the ground, half-sunken, reinforced with interlocked timber and packed earth, its roof layered thick with palm leaves angled just enough to shed water instead of catching it. No straight runoff lines, no exposed seams, no invitation. By the third day, the rain intensified, not louder, heavier. It fell in a way that flattened sound, turning the jungle into a muted, breathing thing. Streams formed where none had existed. Shallow depressions filled and became ponds. Ants climbed trees in black rivers. Snakes sought higher ground. So did people. The first shelter to fail was the tallest. Its roof beams, soaked and swollen, bowed inward. Water pooled instead of draining. When the central support cracked, it did not collapse dramatically. It simply gave up. The roof sank. Water rushed in. The family inside ran out barefoot, clutching what they could carry, eyes wide with disbelief. The boy watched from his doorway as they splashed through knee-deep mud, searching for somewhere, anywhere, that was not surrendering to the rain. They did not come to him. Not yet. By the fourth night, sleep became impossible for most of the settlement. Rain hammered without pause. The ground gave off a sour, wet smell. Fires hissed and died. Mosquitoes bred faster than smoke could repel them. People shifted from foot to foot inside their shelters, listening to water drip where it had never dripped before. Inside the boys' shelter, the sound was different, muted. The roof absorbed impact instead of amplifying it. Water ran off in controlled paths, guided away by shallow channels he had carved into the surrounding earth. The interior air stayed breathable, not fresh, but not choking. He slept in short intervals, not because he was afraid, because he was listening. On the fifth day, the jungle began to move. A section of hillside loosened and slid slowly, silently, taking a line of young trees with it. Roots pulled free with wet, sucking sounds. The ground rearranged itself without warning. A scream followed, then another. One of the shelters nearest the slope had shifted. Its foundation tilted, then cracked. The door jammed. Water poured in from the uphill side, rising fast. People rushed toward it, slipping, grabbing at each other, trying to force the door open while the rain erased their efforts. The boy was already moving. He did not run. Running wasted energy and invited mistakes. He took the narrow path he had kept clear since the first day, boots finding firm ground where others sank. He reached the shelter, assessed the angle, the pressure, the way the earth was still moving. "This way," he said, quietly but firmly. They followed without argument. They always did. Once fear stripped away pride. He led them back to his shelter, one by one, ducking low through the entrance. Water streamed off their clothes onto the packed floor, but did not pool. The drainage channels did their work. Inside, the air felt unreal. Still, dry enough to breathe without coughing. The woman who had screamed pressed her hands to her face and began to cry, not loudly, but with the exhausted sound of someone whose body had been holding itself together by force alone. Others stood frozen, eyes adjusting, minds trying to reconcile what they were feeling with what they believed should be happening. Outside, rain continued to erase the settlement. Inside, nothing worsened. That was when the laughter finally stopped. Not all at once, but completely. The 6-day broke records no one kept track of. Rain fell so hard that even the jungle seemed overwhelmed. Leaves tore free and littered the ground. Branches snapped under accumulated weight. The river beyond the clearing swelled into a brown, churning mass that swallowed its banks and crept outward. People abandoned what remained of their shelters. Some tried to dig trenches. They filled instantly. Others stacked sandbags. They dissolved. By nightfall, there were only 2 kinds of structures left, those that were failing slowly. And the boys. They came quietly now. Not in panic, in shame. One by one, families approached, ducked inside, and took whatever space remained. No one complained about the closeness. No one commented on the simplicity. Wet clothes were wrung out and hung carefully, where airflow would dry them without raising humidity. The boy showed them where to sit, how to lean, where not to block vents. He spoke little, but his presence steadied the room. Outside, something else began. The ground beneath the settlement, saturated beyond capacity, began to breathe water upward. What had been mud turned into slurry. Steps became dangerous. Standing still became exhausting. Inside the shelter, the packed earth floor held. It had been mixed with fibers and ash, layered and compressed over days, not hours. It did not dissolve. It resisted. Someone whispered, "It's the only safe place." The boy did not react. Safety was temporary. Adaptation was permanent. On the 7th night, the river arrived. Not dramatically, relentlessly. Water crept toward the clearing, swallowing debris, lifting fallen branches, pressing against anything that resisted. The sound changed from rain to movement, from impact to flow. People watched from the shelter entrance as the jungle surrendered inch by inch. A man who had mocked the boy openly on the first day stood beside him now, silent, eyes hollow. "I called a joke," he said finally. The boy nodded once. The man swallowed. "You built it like you knew this would happen." "I built it like it already had," the boy replied. The river stopped short of the shelter. Not by chance. The boy had chosen ground slightly higher than the surrounding clearing, subtle enough to be overlooked, significant enough to matter now. Water pooled nearby, but did not overtake them. The rain continued. 8th day. 9th. Time lost shape. Hunger set in, but sickness did not. That mattered. Dryness mattered. When the rain finally weakened, it did not feel like victory. It felt like survival allowing itself to be noticed. The jungle exhaled steam as the sky lightened. Water receded slowly, grudgingly, leaving behind rearranged land and broken certainty. People stepped out of the shelter carefully, like survivors of something they would never fully explain. The clearing was unrecognizable. Shelters gone, foundations erased, paths swallowed, and in the center of it all, the boy's wooden shelter remained. Scarred, mud-splattered, standing. No one laughed. No one spoke for a long time. Then someone said, very quietly, "He didn't fight the rain." The boy looked out at the altered jungle, listening to insects cautiously resume their calls. "No," he said. "He gave it somewhere else to go." And for the first time since the storms began, the jungle agreed. When the rain finally slowed, it did not leave silence behind. It left damage. The jungle did not return to what it had been. It never did. Water peeled layers away and rearranged everything beneath. Where paths once ran straight, there were now curves and dead ends. Where the ground had been solid, it shifted underfoot, unstable and uncertain. People walked carefully now, not because they were afraid of falling, because they no longer trusted the land to behave the way it used to. The boy stepped out of the shelter at dawn on the 10th morning. The sky was pale, washed thin by days of rain, but the clouds were higher now. The downpour had broken into scattered drops that no longer flattened sound. He inhaled. The air smelled different. Sour rot mixed with fresh green growth. Death and renewal sharing the same breath. Behind him, the shelter exhaled slowly, releasing stored moisture without collapsing into dampness. The walls held their shape. The roof sagged only where it was designed to sag, channeling runoff into grooves carved long before the storm began. People followed him out. They moved stiffly, blinking, their bodies adjusting to open space after days pressed close together. No one rushed. No one joked. The settlement looked smaller now. Not because it had shrunk, because confidence had. Entire structures were gone. Others leaned at angles that promised failure the next time weather tested them. Personal belongings lay scattered where water had decided they belonged instead. A man stood staring at the remains of his shelter, hands hanging uselessly at his sides. "It was strong," he said, not to anyone in particular. "I built it strong." The boy stood beside him. "It was tall," he replied. The man turned, confusion flickering across his face. The boy gestured toward the ground. "Strong doesn't mean upright," he said. "It means staying." They spent the day assessing what could be salvaged. Timber warped beyond use was set aside. Anything that still held shape was carried to higher ground. Food that had stayed sealed was shared. Anything spoiled was buried deep enough that the jungle would reclaim it without attracting what followed rot. The boy worked without directing. He simply did what needed to be done. People began to mirror him without realizing it. They placed things where water would not return easily. They stacked weight low instead of high. They stopped trying to restore what had been and started adapting to what was. By midday, the sun broke through for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Steam rose from a forest floor, thick and blinding. The heat returned suddenly, oppressive after so much cold rain. Mosquitoes emerged in clouds, and with heat came sickness. Not immediately, but inevitably. Standing water became breeding ground. Small cuts festered. Coughs turned wet. Bodies weakened by hunger and exhaustion struggled to adjust again. The shelter became more than refuge. It became control. Inside, airflow kept the air from stagnating. Dryness slowed infection. People rotated in and out, using it to recover before returning to the work outside. The boy monitored everything quietly. Who coughed too long? Who moved too slowly? Who avoided eye contact because they were hiding pain? He never announced concerns. He adjusted conditions instead. More airflow, more shade, more rest. One evening, a child collapsed near the edge of the clearing. Not dramatic, just sudden. The boy was there before the second shout finished forming. He carried the child into the shelter, laid her where the ground was coolest, elevated her feet slightly, and cooled her skin without shocking her system. Others hovered uselessly, fear tightening their voices. "She was fine this morning," someone said. "She was tired," the boy replied. They waited. She breathed. Slowly, steadily, she returned. That night, no one questioned where the sick slept. They slept inside. The jungle tested them again 2 days later. Not with rain, with silence. The insects stopped. The birds vanished. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The boy noticed immediately. Silence in the jungle was never neutral. He stood outside the shelter at dusk, watching the trees. The air pressure felt wrong. Heavy, pressing downward. Someone asked if another storm was coming. Not rain, the boy said. They did not like that answer. The ground began to shift again after midnight. Subtle at first. A tremor felt more in the feet than the ears. Soil settling where water had undermined roots. Trees leaning into new angles of stress. Then the hillside opposite, the shelter moved. Slowly, deliberately. A mass of earth, saturated beyond recovery, began to slide. Not toward the shelter. Across the clearing. directly through what remained of the settlement. People woke to the sound of tearing roots and snapping trunks. Panic flared. Lights bobbed wildly. Screams cut through the dark. The boy was already outside. He did not shout. He did not run toward the chaos. He ran toward the shelter. He opened it wide. "Inside," he said, his voice low but unmistakable. They came. Some stumbled. Some carried others. Some froze until hands pulled them forward. The ground shifted underfoot as the landslide passed through the clearing, swallowing debris, burying foundations, dragging away anything not anchored deeply enough. The shelter held. It had been built partly into the ground, not against it. The earth pressed around it instead of tearing it free. Inside, people pressed together again, breath loud in the darkness. The sound outside was unlike anything they had heard. Not a crash, a grinding, as if the jungle itself were rearranging bones. When it stopped, no one moved. They waited. Minutes passed. Then the boy opened the door, just enough to look. The clearing was gone. In its place was a slope of churned earth, broken wood, and uprooted life. Where people had slept weeks earlier, there was now nothing but mud and silence. The shelter stood at the edge of it, unmoved. Someone laughed softly, not from humor, from disbelief. When dawn came, it revealed the truth fully. The settlement, as it had existed, was finished. There would be no rebuilding on that ground. The jungle had made its claim permanent. People gathered around the shelter, staring at the transformed land. "What do we do now?" someone asked. The boy did not answer immediately. He walked the perimeter instead, studying elevation, drainage, the way water would move next time. He knelt, pressed his palm to the soil, smelled it. Then he stood. "We move," he said. "Not far, not dramatically, just enough." They followed him upslope, where the ground was firmer, where trees grew closer together, their roots intertwined in a way that resisted sliding. This time, when shelters were planned, no one argued. They asked. They listened. They dug instead of raised. They curved instead of squared. They layered instead of stacking. The boy did not design everything. He corrected gently. He showed them where water wanted to go. He showed them where wind would break. He showed them how to let the jungle pass through without destroying them. Weeks passed. The rainy season eased. Life stabilized. Shelters took shape that did not resemble the old settlement at all. They looked smaller, lower, quieter. But they stayed dry. They stayed standing. One afternoon, the man who had first laughed the loudest approached the boy again. "I thought building was about proving something," he said, "about showing strength." The boy looked at the forest. "It's about staying when strength leaves," he replied. The man nodded slowly. By the time the rains returned briefly at the end of the season, no one panicked. Water flowed where it was expected. Shelters responded instead of resisted. The boy stood in the doorway of his wooden shelter, watching rain fall again. Lighter this time, manageable. Someone stood beside him. "You saved us," they said. The boy shook his head. "No," he said. "I listened first." The jungle breathed around them, and for now, it allowed them to remain. But the boy knew something they did not yet understand. This place had one more test left, and it would not come as rain. The heat arrived without warning, not the slow, familiar warmth of the jungle easing back into itself, but a heavy, suffocating pressure that settled over everything and refused to lift. The air thickened until movement felt deliberate, almost resisted. Sweat formed instantly and did not evaporate. Even shade offered little relief. The boy noticed it first in the mornings. The ground no longer cooled overnight. When he stepped outside before dawn, the soil beneath his bare hand still held yesterday's heat. The jungle hummed constantly now, insects loud and restless, birds calling at odd hours as if confused by the rhythm of the day. Heat like this was dangerous, not because it burned, because it weakened. People slowed, tempers shortened, small tasks took longer. Water disappeared faster than expected. Food spoiled quickly if not stored correctly, and the shelter, once a refuge from rain, now became something else entirely. Cool, not cold, just enough. People drifted toward it instinctively during the hottest hours. Children napped inside. The sick rested there longer. Even the strongest adults found excuses to linger near its entrance. The boy adjusted again. He widened vents slightly, redirected airflow to draw heat upward and out instead of trapping it. He opened shaded gaps near ground level where cooler air pooled naturally. The shelter responded. Its interior stayed stable. Not perfect, but survivable. One afternoon, the silence returned. Not the tense, watchful silence from before. A deeper one. The insects slowed. The birds stopped calling. Even the wind faded into nothing. The boy felt it immediately. This silence came before fire. He stepped outside and scanned the horizon. The jungle canopy shimmered unnaturally in the distance, heat distorting the air. The smell changed too. Dry, sharp, waiting. Smoke appeared hours later. Thin at first, barely noticeable against the sky. Then thicker, closer. People noticed then. Questions started. Is it far? Is it moving? Will it reach us? The boy did not answer right away. He climbed higher ground and watched. The fire was not fast, but it was wide. A ground fire, feeding on dry undergrowth, moving steadily uphill, driven not by wind but inevitability. Running would not save them. The jungle would close behind them as quickly as it opened. The boy returned to the settlement. Clear everything around the shelters, he said. Down to soil. They moved instantly. No hesitation. Branches were cut. Leaves scraped away. Anything that could carry flame was removed in widening circles. Water was poured where it would slow embers. Paths were cleared not for escape, but for control. The boy focused on his shelter last. He stripped vegetation away completely, exposing bare earth. He dampened the surrounding soil, not soaking it, but enough to prevent ignition. He closed vents on the windward side and adjusted internal airflow to prevent smoke draw. The shelter became sealed, not airtight, intentional. By nightfall, the fire reached the edge of the clearing. Flames did not leap dramatically. They crept, crawled, consumed. The jungle burned low and relentless, a wall of orange advancing with quiet confidence. People gathered near the shelter again. Not inside, around it. The boy watched the fire's behavior carefully. When embers drifted toward the shelter, they died on bare ground. When smoke thickened, it slid over the roof and passed, pulled upward by heat rather than inward. The fire reached the clearing, and slowed. With nothing to feed it, it faltered. Flames licked at the edges and moved on. The shelter stood untouched. People held their breath until the glow faded into the distance. The jungle smoldered through the night. By morning, the fire had passed. What it left behind was blackened earth and silence. The shelter remained. Not scorched, not warped, cool inside. People sat quietly that day, staring at the burned landscape beyond their safe ground. Rain would come eventually. Green would return. But something fundamental had shifted. The boy had not just built something that survived. He had built something that adapted. Storm, flood, heat, fire. The shelter did not fight any of them. It endured. A woman approached him as the smoke thinned. "You never panic," she said. The boy looked at the shelter. "Panic assumes you're late," he replied. "Preparation assumes time." Weeks passed. The jungle healed slowly. New growth pushed through ash. Rain returned gently, welcomed instead of feared. The settlement stabilized again, stronger for what it had lost and learned. The boy continued living quietly. He repaired when needed, adjusted when conditions changed, watched. People still came to him with questions, but fewer now. They had begun to see patterns for themselves. One evening, a child asked him why he stayed in the shelter when he could build something bigger now. The boy smiled faintly. "Big doesn't mean lasting," he said. As seasons turned, the shelter became something more than protection. It became memory, a place where stories were told quietly, where lessons were passed without speeches, where mistakes were examined without blame. Years later, travelers would hear about it, not as a miracle, as a reminder that survival was not about dominating the land. It was about understanding it. Long after the laughter faded, long after the jungle reclaimed scars, the wooden shelter remained. Low, unassuming, still standing, and the boy, once mocked for trusting it, had grown into someone others trusted in return, because when the world tested him, he had not tried to overpower it. He had listened, and that had made all the difference.